Hi everybody, welcome to week 6. The focus of this week is contextually specific perspectives on science learning part 1. This week, Wes, Trev, and I, Amy, will be walking you through STEM and fostering STEM development in the future workforce. You'll see here the structure for our presentation. We'll start with the learning objectives for this week. They came directly from Canvas, and they'll provide us a lens through which we can understand the research. Through the overview of the articles, we'll look for context, purpose for the research, as well as some key definitions. Trev will walk us through Milner, Bolleton, and Morato's research. Wes will walk through Dabney et al.'s research. I will follow that up with implications from the research for teachers and parents. And then we'll make some connections between this week's discussion and last week's and a few weeks before, as well as connections to our previous course. And then we'll look at the discussion prompts for the discussion board. The learning objectives for this week are to become familiar with the contextually specific framework in science education research. This is a recurrent objective that happens week after week, and it's a thread which ties our whole course together. Our next objective is to examine science education in a context that is relevant for students. And it's important to realize here that we're part 1 of 2 weeks that are looking at the contextually specific perspectives in science learning. The context for this week is family and informal science education. Next week will be a slightly different context. Also, to consider how informal and formal science education can complement each other. There's a strong interplay between these two, so watch for that theme as you work our way through the papers. We'll also be looking at the importance of place, community, and the context in science learning. That theme is highlighted really well in the Milner, Bolleton, and Morato research. We'll also be looking to get acquainted with the methods used by science education researchers. The methods is highlighted really well in the Dabney et al. Research. Summary and themes for this week. The guiding purpose for this week's research is the lack of people entering into careers in STEM-related fields. Just a reminder, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. The research this week is being done in the context of family and informal science. We know there are lots of other ways to bolster STEM interest, but this week's research is focusing on family and informal science. Just a couple definitions. Informal science is any science that's occurring outside of school, where formal science is within school. So Milner, Bolleton, and Morato's papers, there are 2 of them, is a futuristic approach where they're looking at students currently in school and how to develop and enhance their interest in STEM, where Dabney et al.'s research is looking at adults who are already in the STEM field and looking back at when they developed an interest in STEM.
All right, howdy folks, this is Trevor. Just talking about the Milner Bolleton research article called Parental Engagement in Children's STEM Education. Just a little background, Marina Milner Bolleton, she's a professor of science education at UBC in the Faculty of Education Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy. She has an MA and PhD in science education from the University of Texas and specializes in science teaching, particularly physics and math, and studies ways of using technology to promote student interest in STEM. And Carlos Morato was a UBC grad, Master of Education student at the time of the study, and later completed his degree in 2018. The purpose of the study was based off of concern about student disengagement from STEM disciplines, and also acknowledging that parents play a vital role in their children's STEM education. Therefore, they found it important to examine how parents can be supported in helping their children to meaningfully engage with STEM. And also there is a paucity of research in this area. So the methodology of the study was to examine parental attitudes towards formal and informal STEM education, as well as parents' motivation for supporting their children and their views on how schools can support families' engagement with STEM. So to achieve this, they had 4 research questions that they were trying to answer. First one being, what are parents' attitudes towards informal STEM education and the challenges to supporting parents with children's STEM education? The second research question was, from parents' perspective, what are effective ways to engage children in STEM education? The third question was, what motivates parents to engage their children with STEM education? And fourth, from parents' perspective, what are effective ways for schools to encourage parents to support their children's STEM education? And we'll come back and revisit these 4 research questions when we're summarizing some of the results and their findings. The sample was taken from adults who had attended the 2016 UBC Family Math and Science Day at UBC in Vancouver. So after attending the Family Math and Science Day, the adults were contacted by email and invited to participate in the study. 29 parents responded to the online questionnaire, and of those 29, 6 were subsequently interviewed either in person or on Zoom. From the responses, the questionnaire yielded quantitative data for the study, and interviews yielded qualitative data. And the results were summarized, and research and practice implications were made, and conclusions drawn from it. Some of the quantitative data that was collected from the questionnaire questions included things like place of birth, age, the parents' level of science and or math education, their reasons to encourage their children to engage with STEM, effective ways for parents to encourage children to study STEM, effective ways for schools to encourage parents to support their children's STEM education, and parental level of familiarity with their children's school STEM program. Responses from the interviews were analyzed qualitatively. So they would look at the transcript from the interviews and try to identify recurring topics that were being brought up by parents, and they would label some of those topics as nodes using software called NVivo 11. And what a node is like, it's similar to a hashtag on social media. So a node can be entered, and then all the comments that are related to that node or hashtag are then grouped together. And they can then use those groups of comments that have been grouped together in the nodes to identify larger themes. And 10 emerging themes were identified, each with a node that was created in Vivo. And then these nodes the purpose was more to identify themes, not necessarily a level of favorability about one topic or another. So what we're looking at here are the 10 nodes that were created on NVivo, of the 10 main themes that had emerged from the interviews. And we notice it shows the number of comments related to each theme on each node. And so the one with the most comments was related to parental attitudes towards STEM, including their own experiences. So again, this is not measuring favorability, whether parents had a positive or negative attitude towards STEM, but it was just showing that there was 66 comments related to their attitudes towards STEM. And the RQ1 you see beside there, I've just added because this is actually related to the first research question that the researchers had asked. It was noted within the study that all 6 interviewees expressed a positive attitude towards and great appreciation for formal and informal STEM education. And in addition, they expressed a great interest in providing their children with STEM enrichment. So of those 66 comments were generally positive, showing a positive attitude towards STEM. But it's important to note this was a group of parents. It's a small sample. It's a group of parents that are already attending with their children a informal science event on a weekend, and some of these parents had backgrounds in the education field, so it's probably not representative of the population as a whole. So now we're going to see some of the responses to the questionnaire questions. This is the quantitative data. And these next couple slides relate directly to the research questions that were asked. So the first one here are effective ways to encourage children to study STEM, based off what the parents' responses were. So you can take a moment just to look through these. This set of responses was based off of the third research question, participants' reasons to encourage their children to engage with STEM. So pause for a moment to look at responses. And lastly, this set of responses correlates with research question number 4, which was participants' views on how schools can engage parents. So you can look at the responses there. So we touched on some of the limitations of this study earlier, but just to review them in a little more detail here. This study had a very small sample size. There were only 29 sets of parents who completed the online questionnaire. And beyond that, there were only 6 sets of parents who were subsequently interviewed. There was also some question over where the participants came from. It wasn't exactly clear whether they were all locals from the Lower Mainland or if they were, came from rural areas or other areas besides Vancouver. So not sure about the demographics there. And also the sample was taken only from parents already attending an informal science outreach program. So it wasn't like they were walking around downtown Vancouver and just asking random people on the street. They were only asking people that were already attending an informal science outreach program. So these were some of the limitations of the study.
Hello everyone, this is Wes, and I'll be talking about Dabney et al.'s paper titled Informal Science, Family Education, Experiences, and Initial Interest in Science. This paper's lead author is Catherine Dabney, who is an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. She holds a doctorate in science education from the University of Virginia and has research interests in formal and informal educational experiences that influence achievement, literacy, and eventually persistence in science-related career fields, especially among underrepresented groups in STEM. Robert Tye is an associate professor at the University of Virginia. He has a doctorate in education from Harvard and is the proprietor of Project Crossover. We will discuss Project Crossover in more detail later, but it is a study conducted by Robert Tye that looks to uncover the mechanisms in transitioning from a graduate student to scientist in chemistry and physics. This project is the basis for this paper. Michael Scott was a master's student at University of Virginia at the time of this paper and is now a PhD candidate in education at the University of Texas. We were not able to find information about him to decide whether or not he was deserving of the world's best boss coffee mug, like another well-known Michael Scott. Purpose of the study. With concerns about the size of the STEM workforce, science education and the development of science interest and engagement have become a focus of educational policy in the U.S. Entrance and retention of the workforce in the physical sciences of chemistry and physics is challenging, leading to an examination of the factors that may influence persistence in physical sciences. This leads us to the research questions. Does the education level of physical scientist parents associate with participation in informal science experiences? And also, which informal science experiences are associated with physical scientists that report an initial personal interest in science by elementary school? Before looking at the details of Dabney's paper, here is a summary of the main points from their literature review. Parental education. Multiple sources cited showed trends in parents with higher levels of education spending more time with their children and more time doing developmentally appropriate activities with their children, which led to greater interest in school. Family experiences in informal science. Science-related activities such as libraries, science fair, and museum visits have a positive effect on student attitudes towards science. Parental occupation. Children with parents in STEM are more likely to enter STEM fields as well. Hobbies. Science and science-related recreational activities increased interest in STEM for children. Encouragement. Children's career interest and positive attitudes towards school are highly influenced by parent involvement. Initial personal interest in science. Developing academic interest in STEM early builds confidence and increases likelihood of choosing a STEM major. Parental education and privilege. Students with parents who have a higher income level in education are more likely to complete a STEM degree, with males disproportionately earning doctoral degrees in physical sciences compared to females. Methodology. Survey data for this paper came from Robert Tye's ongoing Project Crossover, a study of the transition from student to scientist, which seeks to uncover the mechanisms in transitioning from a graduate student to scientist in chemistry and physics. The Project Crossover survey includes data from 4,285 participants from chemistry and physics doctoral students, scientists, and individuals holding other doctoral physical science degrees. The data set is nationally representative according to demographics and employment backgrounds when compared to the National Science Webcast Bar, which is a U.S. government science and engineering database. This paper consisted of 2 research questions. The first research question sought to find the association of parental education on family informal science experiences. A multiple regression model was used, and this model was used to infer relationships between the level of parent engagement and 4 positive statements of family experiences in informal science from the Project Crossover survey. The correlation between each statement was assessed to see if they could each be treated as individual variables for the second research question. These were: science was involved in at least one parent's jobs, science was a diversion or a hobby, science was viewed as a pathway to a better career, and science was encouraged to the same degree as other academic pursuits. The second research question focused on looking at the association of family informal science experiences on personal interest in science by grades K to 5. They used a logistic regression model which predicted whether or not different informal science experiences from research question number 1 had an impact on personal interest in science. The independent variables for the model were based on the results from research question number 1 and included the same 4 positive forms of family informal science experience, namely that science was involved in at least one parent's job, was it a diversion or a hobby, was viewed as a pathway to better career, and was encouraged to the same degree as other academic pursuits. Here are the results for research question number 1. Families with higher parental education are more likely to take part in informal science experiences. They are more likely to provide positive encouragement for children to develop an early interest in science. They are more likely to have diversions or hobbies related to science. They are more likely to have careers in STEM, and they are more likely to see science as a pathway to a better career. Additionally, each of the 4 variables were found to have low correlation to each other and did not overlap. Therefore, each could be used as an independent variable for research question number 2. The main results from research question number 2 were that family forms of informal science education, such as occupation, diversions and hobbies, and encouragement, all associated with early interest in science by elementary school. Using the logistic regression model, we can see that all forms of family informal science experiences are significantly associated with personal interest in science by grades K to 5 after controlling for demographic and background factors. For example, the values highlighted in the blue oval shows that survey respondents had a 1.66 times higher odds of reporting a personal interest if science was involved in at least one parent's job. The red oval highlights even greater odds that when science was a diversion or hobby among the family, participants had 2.83 times higher odds of reporting a personal interest by grades K to 5. You can see the other 2 variables of the family viewing science as a pathway to a better career and being equally encouraged with other subjects were found to have 1.54 times and 1.70 times, respectively, higher odds of participants reporting a personal interest in science by grades K to 5. In terms of limitations of the study, we had questions around the ability of adult scientists in their 40s or 50s being able to accurately remember pre-elementary school events that sparked their interest in science. I personally have a hard time remembering what I ate for dinner last night, let alone what made me interested in science when I was 3 years old. The database was a very select group of participants from chemistry and physics backgrounds. Engineers, life scientists, doctors, etc. were not part of the study. A broader view of scientists may or may not have yielded different results. Lastly, we thought that future research into specific hobbies and diversions and their impact would be an interesting follow-up to the study, especially considering all 3 of us have young children that we would like to see take an interest in STEM.
Now that we've gone through the research, we can look at the implications from that research for teachers and parents. For teachers, families with lower education levels are often underrepresented in informal science. Just something to keep in mind when you're looking at the demographics of your school community. Engagement in STEM begins in elementary school or earlier. One more thing for our elementary school teachers. Educate the family as a whole is a bonus, as well as providing parents with STEM program details in a non-online format. Really stressing the non-online format there. Inform parents whenever possible about out-of-school STEM opportunities and incorporate interactive STEM activities within your own lessons. Some parental implications. It was found that an increase in parental education leads to an increase in informal science opportunities for students, which leads to an increase in interest in STEM by K to 5, which is just super interesting considering that we are all here doing our Masters in Science Education. The purpose for this slide is to provide some prompts and some sparks for our discussion board this week. These are our own connections that we made between this week's content and last week's and the previous week's, as well as some connections to our previous course. We know that there is a connection, a complementarity between formal and informal science, and we're wondering if that extends to parental epistemology and its impact on a child's STEM interest and resulting ontology for science knowledge. Basically, how a parent knows STEM may impact what a child knows about STEM, and maybe there's a connection there between parental epistemology and parental education, an area for future research. This week's research tells us that parental engagement and informal science are important, but has not been determined why they are so important. So we were wondering, maybe there's some connections to some other concepts that we've talked about this week, and previous weeks. So we're wondering if maybe a child's conceptual ecological development may start earlier, and that's why their interest in STEM happens, maybe an area for future research. Maybe scientific knowledge development, when we're talking about the KT versus the KE model, maybe that plays a role here as well. Maybe a throwback to our previous course, the incitement of wonder and place-based learning in new environments, maybe they're playing a role here in having informal science outside of school, and that's what's sparking the wonder and sparking the engagement in STEM. And maybe we're wondering if there's a relationship between early interest in STEM and the development of misconceptions. Are there more or less? Just an area for more research. These are the discussion questions for this week's discussion board. We are very much excited to hear about your thoughts, connections, and experiences with STEM interest in informal science.